So, to our guest, Nick Bradley was born in Germany in 1982, and he grew up in Bath. He studied English literature at university before moving to Japan, where he lived and worked for many years, becoming fluent in the language and immersed in the culture. Since returning to the UK, he has become a teacher of creative writing at Cambridge and the University of East Anglia, and he has put out two novels. The first, The Cat in the City, comprised a series of ingeniously linked stories, all set in Tokyo and all, in one way or another, featuring cats. His second and latest novel, Four Seasons in Japan, released earlier this year, it's great acclaim, sees him return to some of the characters featured in that first book, namely Flo Dunthorpe. So, just to give you a quick synopsis of the new book, in case you haven't read it, Flo is a young American translator who has had some success with her translation book of Japanese stories, but is now in a bit of a creative and emotional rut, unable to decide what to translate next, and feeling very lonely in the metropolis of Tokyo. That all changes, however, when she finds a mysterious book left by a drunken passenger on the Tokyo subway. From here on, Four Seasons in Japan toggles between Flo's story and the story of the book. This, in brief, is the story of Kyo, a 19-year-old from Tokyo who, when he fails his university exams, is sent to a cram school in the small, remote town of Onimichi, where his grandmother lives. What follows is a year in the lives of Kyo and his grandmother Ayako, two chalk and cheese characters who are nevertheless united by a shared history of trauma. Not wanting to spoil anything more, Nick, I really enjoyed the book. And what immediately struck me about it, I suppose, was yeah, just how vividly you evoked Japan, which I assume comes from you living and working there. So perhaps we could just start by you, yeah, just telling us a little about your relationship with the place. When and why did you first move to Japan?
Ooh, wow. Yeah, that's a big question. Um, so first, before I get started, George, thanks very much for having me, and also thanks to everyone for tuning in. I know there's a ton of other things that people could be doing right now, but yeah, no, it's great to be here. So thank you for having me. Um, so I suppose what's what's interesting about the two novels I've released is that, in a sense, they're in reverse order in terms of me and my life and the chronology of my experience. Because the second novel's set in Onamichi, in a small town in Hiroshima Prefecture, and that was actually the first place I lived in Japan. Um, I lived there for many years before moving up to Tokyo, which is where my first novel set. So my first novel is set in Tokyo. Second novel set in the first place I lived in Japan. So it should really be the other way around. But um, I think the reason it isn't the other way around is because I found it very difficult to write about rural Japan. And that was mainly because I really loved it. I really had an amazing time there, and my life was wonderful. And as we all know, that happiness doesn't necessarily um, produce good fiction, because you tend to need the negative emotions as well, or the um, yeah, you need the darker side of life to bring in that conflict. So I think I found, for my first novel, writing about Tokyo um, was something that perhaps came to me a bit easier, because I'd wanted to move to Tokyo for a long time. And when I did get there, I felt slightly frustrated by it, and I felt slightly let down by it in a lot of ways. It wasn't the place that I thought it was going to be. So I think it was very easy to write about Tokyo, but I've often tried to write about Hiroshima, and I've always kind of failed in a sense. And this was, I think, my idea was that I wanted to write another book about Japan, but I wanted to focus on the rural aspect. And so that's why I chose to set the book in Onamichi. I lived just one train stop from Onamichi, in a town called Itosaki, which is an even smaller fishing village, which has been kind of amalgamated into another city called Mihara. So when I first moved to Japan, I didn't speak Japanese, but I took community language classes once a week in Onomichi. So I would get on the train and I'd go to a kind of community center where I'd have a one-to-one lesson and learn Japanese. So for me, Onomichi is really where the beginning of my journey with Japanese culture and language began. And it's also just a wonderful place. And I think, my first book came out in lockdown. So I wrote it before lockdown, but it was, I think, when the book came out, it was lockdown and the bookshops were shut. There were no in-person literary events or anything. But when I started thinking about writing a second novel, it was with a certain escapism that I did so, because I wanted to get back to Japan. I wanted to go back to Onomichi. So for me, it was just a pleasant experience to go back there and think about the place. So yeah, Onomichi also, it's a sort of artistic town in respects, because the novel Tokyo Story, sorry, the film Tokyo Story features characters who come from Onomichi who go to Tokyo. And so I decided to turn that on its head and have a character who's from Tokyo that goes to Onomichi. So that's kind of why the places started to feature in fiction, I think. Yeah.
So why did you end up in Onomichi to start with? That doesn't seem the likeliest place to move to first in Japan.
Yeah, good question. So basically, like, I first moved out to Japan on the JET program, which is a fantastic program that puts university graduates into, basically gets you a job in the Board of Education in a town. So I worked for the Mihara City Board of Education, and I worked for them all year round. And during the term times, I would go into junior high schools, state junior high schools, 4 of them in the city, and I was an assistant language teacher, so I would be there in the English lessons. But the job was great because even in the school holidays, you still had to go to work. But so I ended up in an office in the Board of Education, and it was there that I picked up some of the other things that came with the job, qualifications in translation, interpretation, things like that. So that's originally what took me to Hiroshima Prefecture, because one of the things with the JET program is they don't allow you to choose where you go. And so I very much left things up to fate, and they offer you a place, and you don't have a say in the location. So you either go or you don't go. So when I moved out there, I remember trying to Google the town I was living in, and this just shows you when it was, but there were absolutely no pictures online of the place. The only thing I could find in it was on the Japan Lonely Planet Guide. It said Mihara City, and it said something like along the lines of this is not worth visiting. that was it. So I really didn't know what I was getting myself in for, but at that time in my life, that was what I wanted. I wanted to go somewhere to be completely lost and immersed in new culture and new language.
Well, yeah, I wonder if something it was good for was learning Japanese. I mean, Flo, uh, in the novel, says that she too learned Japanese by moving to a fairly small town. I guess there weren't many English speakers there, so full immersion, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I did find, yeah, my friends who were placed in the cities, yeah, their Japanese didn't progress because they didn't need to, because there was
Mm.
a community. But yeah, George, have you been to Japan?
I have not, no. So forgive all my very ignorant
No,
questions.
no. I'm just always interested to hear where people have been, where they enjoyed. So yeah.
mm, um, well, the other main character in the book, Kyo, the protagonist of this kind of novel within a novel, when he first moves to Onomichi to live with his grandmother, he can barely understand them and has great trouble with the kind of dialect. Are there very kind of distinct dialects in different regions of Japan?
Yeah, very much so, very much so. And my problem was the reverse. So I first learned Hiroshima dialect, and it wasn't until I went on a trip to Osaka I realized that there were certain words that just weren't used outside of Hiroshima. Um, and this is true all through Japan, that there's a very strong regionalism in different places, and the dialects do diverge quite significantly, and they're dialects because they use different words for things rather than just accents, which are more common, I think, even in the UK. We have lots of accents, but we don't have that many dialects. But in Japan, there are plenty of dialects where even verbs change. Yeah, so it's one of those things where it's kind of like American English, I suppose, and British English, in that British people tend to understand American English because of exposure to films and things like that. So Tokyo dialect and Kansai dialect are well known because they're quite, that you can see those on TV. But the reverse is not always true. So people who are from, say, Tohoku in the north, they have a very strong, difficult dialect, and they will even put subtitles on the TV screen for people when they're speaking, so that people who aren't from Tohoku will understand what they're saying. So yeah, there is a very kind of strong, which I think could be connected to this concept of there's uchi soto, so inner community and outer. And I think in Japan, having a kind of community is very important. So I think even dialects are kind of there to sort of preserve the community, in that people outside of that community don't understand them. So there's a kind of tacit understanding there. Yeah.
Mm. Are these differences reflected in the writing, or is the written Japanese quite sort of standard and universal?
Yeah, so historically so standard Japanese used to be the Japanese that came out of Kansai, so Kyoto, when Kyoto was the capital. That was kind of more widely appreciated as being standard Japanese. But when they moved the capital up to Edo, which is now Tokyo, that therein started Tokyo. The sort of standard Japanese became akin to what they speak in Tokyo. So there is a sort of standardized Japanese, like a textbook Japanese, or one that everyone understands. And I suppose it's kind of like our history with RP, received pronunciation. So a kind of way of speaking English that for the radio and for TV that everyone can understand. Yeah, so there is what's kind of classed as standard Japanese, but then something like Osaka dialect became very popular because there were lots of comedians from Osaka who were on TV, and so people start to copy the way they speak. Yeah, but there is definitely a this is correct and this is dialect.
Right. So was the fascination with Japan with you from a very early age? Why did you always want to go there?
It's a weird one, actually. It was kind of just serendipity. I didn't have. I was interested in the world. I think I knew I wanted to go somewhere, but I didn't know where. And I think at that time, so I'd done a master's degree in English literature, and I had a place to do a PhD in English literature. And just by chance, actually, one of my friends at the time, so she was doing her PhD and she was Japanese. And she said, "What are you going to do next year or something?" And I said, "I'm not sure. I might go teach English abroad." And she said, "You should go to Japan. You should do the JET program." And I didn't really think anything of it. I got another place to teach English in Thailand, and I just thought, I think I'll go to Japan and then I'll go on holiday to Thailand. But I had no knowledge of Japan, and I think I barely even eat Japanese food. I think my parents took me out for Japanese food when it was decided that I was going. The only thing that I can say that I had a tiny bit of knowledge about was I was very much into cinema, and I love to watch films from all over the world. So I'd watched quite a bit in terms of Japanese cinema. Yeah, but I wasn't someone who was, I really must go to Japan, and I think there wasn't the popularity around Japan that there is now. I hear a lot of young people who are very into Japanese culture, but I think when I was growing up, it wasn't. I know that my friends from America had a lot more exposure to Japanese culture growing up than we did. And actually, I found when I moved to Japan, that was when I first really started getting into Japanese literature. And a lot of the time it was American publications, it was American editions of Japanese novels in translation that I was getting hold of. And a lot of these writers weren't actually translated and published in the UK at that time. Um, so yeah, I think it was once I'd moved to Japan, I also, as an English literature graduate, my first instinct was to think, well, if I want to get to know a culture, the best thing to do is to read lots and lots of books by Japanese authors. So I just immersed myself in reading those. And then I think after about a year, and just when the obsession of the language came in too, then it started, my goals shifted slightly, and it started to be, now I want to read these novels in the original. So there was a sort of progression there. But yeah, I think literature was another huge way that I found my way into Japanese culture. And the same goes for film. I think I expanded on my, the Japanese films that I was watching. Yeah.
Mm. Um, so what eventually took you out of uh, the Hiroshima prefecture to Tokyo, and then what did you do in Tokyo?
Yeah. So after I finished on JET, I left after 4 years. Um, by that time I'd got a qualification to work as a translator and an interpreter. So I started to work for just different organizations. I mean, I was still in my 20s, and I was still you know struggling to work out what it was I wanted to do in life. So I worked for Honda, and I worked for Nintendo. So I worked in different industries, just translating or like interpreting and things like that. It was when I moved up to Tokyo that I kind of really got um, acquainted with that city. And when I was working in Tokyo, I was working for a very old, large, the biggest travel agency in Japan called JTB. And I had a very strange job for them. So it was, on the face of it, it was an office job, translating, but it was also a job that required lots of travel. So I would travel to different parts of the country where local governments would pay our company to make websites to attract English speakers as foreign tourists. So I would end up traveling to different parts of Japan, and I would have to photograph those locations, and I would have to either I would write my own script in English, or I would be given a script by the Japanese local government, and I would just translate their script, and then I would liaise with a Japanese website designer to make websites that were sort of introducing these locations to English speakers. So it was a really wonderful opportunity, but I also found it quite hard. I mean, like, I know you probably don't want to hear me complain about my job where I was traveling around and staying in all these wonderful hotels and everything, but actually it was surprisingly hard because I was working in a company as an average Japanese employee. So I was recruited as any of my fellow Japanese colleagues was. I had to take the written test in Japanese. I had to do 3 interviews in Japanese, all this stuff. But what I found difficult about it was I would I was living in a very kind of tiny room in Tokyo, but I would be sent off to these extremely, lavish, opulent hotels, and I would take photos of them, and I would stay in them, and I'd eat the food, but then I would go back, and I would just be in this miserable job in Tokyo, and I actually found it really difficult, and not just because of that, but also because I was coming to an understanding that I'd lost my way slightly. That as interesting as my life was, I'd always wanted to be a writer ever since I was a child, and that dream had kind of fallen by the wayside. I'd become a translator, and I was living in Tokyo, but I was very much in a company where there was a glass ceiling, and I wasn't going to progress. So yeah, that's kind of where I found myself in Tokyo, working for a Japanese company, doing lots of overtime, and really not having much of a life. Yeah.
There are some photos in the book actually. I wonder, are they yours?
Well, they're flows.
Of course, yes.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, I mean, it's weird, isn't it? I don't even want to admit that, but I feel like I would be taking credit from my character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, well, yeah, would it just uh to sort of take us a bit closer to the book? Would I be right in saying that one of the things that interests you most about Japan is its relationship with cats, which are both a big part of this book. We have one on the cover. Even more so of your last. And I also understand that you hold a PhD focusing on the figure of the cat in Japanese literature. Many questions here. The first being, so yeah, what significance do cats hold in Japanese culture, first of all?
This is dangerous because I could talk for so long about this. Um, Now, where to begin? Okay, I'll try and do this as quickly as I can because I don't want to just talk about cats in Japanese literature. But basically, um, there are a number of factors as to why cats are so important in Japan, um, as they aren't in, say, China, where if you look at the zodiac, the cat is not in the zodiac, and there's actually a historical idea in Buddhism that the cat is sort of condoned because it laughed it laughed at some inappropriate moment in the Buddha's life. So cats have a very special place in Japan, and the reason they do is because they weren't indigenous to Japan. They were brought over, and the reason they were brought over is they were brought over with Buddhist scriptures. So on boats, because the rats and mice would eat the scriptures, and so then it was only logical that once the cats were brought to Japan, they were then taken to the temples with the scriptures to carry on uh, protecting the scriptures. And so they kind of entered the society as this, a protector of the word of Buddha, which is completely different to the image that they had on the mainland, cats, that is. Um, and then you start to get lots of folk tales that involve like touching friendships between Buddhist priests and cats. So there are kind of folk tales that deal with that. But then there's another strand of folktale, mythological folktale, where people in the towns, the average Joe, didn't know what a cat was, and at that time Japan was vegetarian, so you'd have cats walking around town looking for something tasty to eat, and at that time they used a kind of fish oil in the lamps, so the cats could smell the fish oil and they would try and get at it. They walk on their hind legs, and someone in the town might see a weird cat walking on its hind legs with the reflection of the lantern in its eyes and think, "Whoa, that thing's scary." So then you have strains of myth where which are bakeneko, so and neko mata. So these are shape shifting cats that can take on human form and then can return to cat form. So you have that, but then also you have in the Japanese court, um, princesses saw the cats and thought they were cute, kawaii. So they took them as pets. But then there's a very famous like novel called The Tale of Genji, which is thought to be the first novel in the whole world. And it was published in Japan. It was written by a woman. But there's an integral scene in The Tale of Genji where a cat accidentally opens a curtain and reveals a princess to a guy standing outside who wasn't supposed to see her, and that moment brings about a downfall for both characters. And that was often illustrated in the manuscripts of The Tale of Genji. And so that began a kind of a depiction of cats in art in Japan. And there was even an artist who used to substitute humans for cats to sidestep what's it called, censorship laws and things like that. But then you have Natsume Soseki, one of the great novelists of Japan. Pretty much the godfather of the modern novel in Japan. He was an expert in British literature and was seconded to London for 2 years to study English literature. He kind of went mad in London. He returned to Japan, and it was at that point, though, that he really, really went mad with reverse culture shock. And he started to write a short story called I Am a Cat, which was critical of society, but was narrated from the perspective of a cat. So he kind of sidestepped censorship in the same way as the artist. But that short story was so popular, he became a serialized short story. So he would write versions of it that were published in this magazine. Eventually, it was collected into a novel. But that novel, I Am a Cat, began a trend, and he had many disciples, and they wrote their own cat books. And so there became a huge sort of tradition of writing a cat book, almost in homage to him. And it got to the stage where, and this was something that I was looking at in my PhD, I came up with a term, and you'll have to forgive me, this is an awful pun, but in European literature, we have this concept of the pathetic fallacy, where the weather mirrors the character's inner emotions. Well, I posit that in Japanese literature, they have this thing called the pathetic fallacy, which is where the emotions of the characters are mirrored in the behavior of the cat. So plenty, yeah, sorry, I mean, I told you I could just keep talking about this for ages.
That's fascinating.
An economist in a university in Kansai, a professor who's come up with this concept of neconomics, which is neko is the word for cat and economics, and he's made a portmanteau. And his theory is that cats have actually raised the GDP of Japan, like quite significantly as a kind of cultural export. And you only have to look at the British publishing industry and its obsession with cats in Japan. So yeah, that's just a kind of sorry, I feel like I've really gone off on one with the cats, but yeah.
No, thank you. Yeah, you've expanded my knowledge beyond the waving cat toy, so thank you.
Yeah.
Uh, as I said in my intro, Flo, the main character of this book, was also a character in your last book. When did you know you wanted to revisit her as a character and, in fact, expand her story?
That's a good question. Um, yeah, bearing in mind, fiction writers are kind of liars, and also I'm getting old and I forget things, and so I might make things up and embellish them slightly here. But I think what happened was, I knew I wanted characters to come back from my first book, but I wasn't sure when and at what point. But the way I wrote this book was I wrote The Sound of Water. Originally it was going to be just that. So I sat down, and I think in 2 months or 3 months I wrote from start to finish. I wrote The Sound of Water and it pretty much as it is. So Joe's and Ayako's perspectives and their interactions. And I put it away, as I do when I finish a draft. And I came back to it. And when I read it, it read a lot like it was translated from Japanese. Like there was no escaping it. It was so heavily influenced by the work of Natsume Soseki and some other Japanese writers who I love. And so when I read it, I felt quite strange, and I felt like almost like I hadn't written it. And it was that sense of if I hadn't written it, and if it reads like it's translated, then who translated it, and also who wrote it? So it was at that point that Flo, I started to think about her, because I thought, well, she had a kind of sense of an ending in The Cat in the City, but all that ending was that she published her translation, and I thought, well, yeah, but life goes on. Like she still has to live, and in some ways, I thought. And this is not quite how I feel about things, but it's maybe something that I can understand, and a lot of my friends who are writers have experienced. But if you spend your whole life with a goal and then you achieve that goal, in some ways that's actually scarier than not achieving it. Because if you have that thing to live for, if you wake up every day and you have that kind of drive to do something, that's actually what's really lovely. That's what I love about writing. In a way, I love, my favorite thing about writing is doing it, is waking up in the day and thinking, I've got the morning to myself to work on my book. That to me brings me joy. But actually publishing the book and all the things that happen surrounding publication, everything, that I don't really like that stuff. That stuff doesn't bring me joy. But I think a lot of people, in their minds, they think of that as being the goal, the publication part. And that's not really how I feel about it. But I started to wonder, though, in Flo's story, a lot of what she wanted was in The Cat in the City, at least, I feel like she had a goal. She was kind of lonely. That was one thing, but also she had a goal to be a literary translator. And I thought, well, sure, but like translating one book and publishing it does not necessarily a literary translator make. So it started making me think about, what was her next project? What's she doing now? So I think that's where flow came back into the book. And before I wrote her parts, I remember writing emails to her, and she wrote emails back to me. So we had a kind of email exchange about what was going on. And that was how I kind of got my head into the idea of creating the extra level. Obviously, that stuff, it's not fiction, and it doesn't go in the book, but it's the part beneath the water of the iceberg. It's the stuff that's going on behind the scenes that readers don't see.
Mm. Um, I understand you wrote your previous book while you were doing the UEA's creative writing course.
Yes.
Yes. Perhaps you could talk about a little what that course did for your writing and how it shaped your first book.
Oh, the course changed my life. It really did. And so I'm teaching on the MA at the moment. I'm teaching the workshop, which is a bit strange for me because for me that 1 year that I spent doing the creative writing MA at UEA, it changed my writing. It changed my life. But how did it change it? I remember the first workshop I had. I'd already written an entire novel set in Japan. It was about a half Japanese, half British kid who finds out he's grown up not knowing that he was half Japanese, and he finds out because his dad tells him, and he finds out also that his mother's still alive and all this sort of stuff. But anyway, it was a kind of I wrote this novel before I started at UEA, and for me, that's one of the most important novels I've ever written. I never tried to get it published. Um, I but it was important to me because it proved to me that I could do it, that I could finish a whole novel. So, but when I started the course at UEA, I asked my tutors about it. I said, I've got this novel, what should I do? And they said, put it away and just try new things. So I listened to them and I did that. I put that novel away. I thought, well, I want to write a sci-fi novel that's got a cult in it. So I started writing that, and I workshopped it, and I got kind of people were nice, but I could tell it wasn't good. They were like, yeah, really enjoyed it. But it was when I went for my tutorial after the workshop, and I talked to my to the person who ended up supervising my PhD, who's Giles Foden, the guy who wrote The Last King of Scotland, and he's a fantastic teacher. But he just asked me, what have you been up to in your life? And so I told him about Japan and everything, and he said, you've got to write about this. You've got to write about Japan. And I didn't want to at the time because I felt like I'd already written this novel in Japan. I was kind of over it. But I thought, well, I'll write a short story. And it was in The Cat in the City. It was the seventh story or so, the one which is set at a festival where the cat appears. And I wrote that story, and the reaction to it in the workshop was just palpable. And I knew that I had to write that book. So yeah, The Cat in the City started in the second workshop that I had at UEA. I wrote about half of it on UEA MA, and then I continued to work on it for my PhD. I think I finished it about a year into my PhD. And yeah, so that's how. But why did the UEA MA help me? I think it was just even being admitted to the program and knowing how competitive it is. Just made me think, oh, maybe you can do this, because I think I'd been a very shy writer up until that point. I spent a lot of time working on short stories. I tried to write novels that I'd thrown out I kept getting to about 20,000 words and I would throw it out. And I think it was when I got accepted to the program at UEA that I actually managed to finish that other novel. So I think I was about 30,000 words with it. And then even just getting accepted gave me the courage to just whip through and write the remaining 70,000 words or whatever. But yeah, the validation of getting onto the program, I did feel when I got on that I was one of the worst people there. But in a lovely way, that meant that I had so much to learn from my peers. I also had a lot of pressure. I had to work very hard because other people were much more talented than I was. And I still think that talent is worthless in a way, because hard work is what gets you to places. And in some ways, being talented makes you think that you don't have to work hard, but you do. You know, in life you have to work hard and be talented. But I think what you don't have in talent, you can make up for in hard work, and that, I think that's what the MA taught me. That, you know, basically, in order to improve, you just have to work very, very hard. So that's what I learned from it. But it was just a fantastic year, you know, being able to just immerse myself entirely in literature, and to have all these friends who were also wanting to be writers, and tons of people recommending me different books, you know, things I hadn't been exposed to. Yeah, it's just an exciting time, I think.
Mm. Would you say it actually shaped the structure of your first book? For those who haven't read it, it's kind of written in quite, I don't want to say short stories, because they all kind of come together in this sort of novelistic weave eventually, but they're quite sort of discrete
Yeah.
chapters. Were you sort of submitting one per workshop, or?
No, you're spot on, George. You're spot on. It really did shape the structure of the book. Like, I think my experiences of workshopping that first chapter of the sci-fi cult story, um, made me realize that workshopping novels wasn't good, because what I found was you put in an extract and everyone talks about everything outside of the words on the page. So I immediately calibrated and thought, well, what I'll do is I'll tell everyone each time, I'll say, this is a short story, that each one is going to be set in Tokyo. Each one is going to feature a stray cat, and I'm going to reuse characters and link it all up at the end. So absolutely, like, my first book is entirely shaped by the workshopping culture of a creative writing MA, because I realized the best thing to do, and how I could get the most out of a session, was to make sure that what I was writing was discrete, but was also something that could add up to a larger structure. And that is also still how I think novels get written. Um, People have this idea that short story writers and novelists are doing something completely different, and I think they are sometimes. But I think you could probably find a short story writer and a novelist who write exactly the same. For me, a chapter in itself should be a short story. It should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's in making that hard brick unit of the chapter and putting it aside, and constantly just making these bricks, which is each chapter. And then afterwards, you look at all the bricks you've got, and then you can start to think, okay, what structure can I make from this? And that's, so yeah, it was really the workshopping culture that influenced that structure. And I think it was also how I wrote my second book as well. I really just, I envisaged that I was writing a chapter for a workshop, which didn't happen. But in my mind, I said, this chapter has to be at the level that I would be comfortable sending it in to be, critiqued by my peers. And once I'd written it, I'd move on to the next one, and that's how I wrote it. Yeah.
Mm. Um, in terms of what you're working on next, then might you revisit some characters from the first two books again?
Yeah, so I'm worried though. I think one of the reasons why novelists don't answer this question, or they're elusive, I think, is because you could set off on something and then scrap it, or so it could well be. So this has to be taken with just a pinch of salt. But I'm working on something at the moment. I'm about 2 chapters away from completing the first draft. It's not set in Japan. One of the strands does have a Japanese connection, and one of the strands does have a cat connection. But I can say that one strand is set in contemporary UK, one is set in the 1990s in America, and one is set in space. So it's not set in Japan though, but like there is a certain and also, yes, characters and things from my first 2 books do feature in this third thing I'm working on. And I'm kind of viewing this as like the trilogy of the cats. So I don't know, those who Murakami lovers will know that his first 3 novels are part of what's called the trilogy of the rat. So I'm trying to sort of respond to that with the Trilogy of the Cat, which is 3 novels that can be read entirely alone, but are part of this same thing, which I'm calling the Necoverse, which is where this world that I've created. Yeah.
Well, that's something to look forward to. Both of your books to date have epigraphs of Japanese poems that you've translated. Is that something you want to do more of? Have you, or would you like to translate a Japanese novel, for instance, as Flo is?
Um, Hypothetically speaking, if a publisher were to approach me and ask me to translate a Japanese novel, I probably would do it. So I can safely say that yeah, I'd be very happy to translate a Japanese novel, as long as it was someone who I, connected with. And for the epigraph for my third book, I already have like a poem in mind, which I translated for 4 seasons in Japan. But I then decided to go with a different poem. So, but I would love to use this epigraph, which is again it's in Japanese and has my translation. So yeah, I definitely want to keep in my eye with translation. Um, so yeah, and I like a lot of writers who I like, Japanese writers, tend to do both. They translate English to Japanese, and they also write their own fiction. I think translating a novel, and I've experienced this with my own translators, some of whom I've become very good friends with. Um, they are the best readers. Translation is the closest reading you can do. And with my first book in particular, I found, it goes through editing, it goes through copy editing, it goes through proofreading, but it's not until you get translated that the final errors get ironed out of the book. Because translators interrogate every single word to a level that most proofreaders don't. Yeah, yeah.
Have these novels been translated into Japanese?
Not into Japanese yet,
Right.
but I don't think they will.
Mm,
These two, I don't think,
right.
because I think these books are written very much in the spirit of writing for non-Japanese readers. So I just don't see a Japanese person deriving as much pleasure from them. That's just my thought. But I'm hoping that my third novel will. Um, so yeah, I mean they've been translated into Chinese, but not into Japanese. It,
Right.
it's noticeable. But yeah, I hope one day. I hope one day. I do have readers in Japan who read them in English and then write to me, and they're always really lovely and complimentary. But yeah, yeah, we'll see. We'll see with Japan.
Cool. Probably time to ask a few questions that people have been sending in. Thank you for these, everyone. This is from Jenny. You write of Flo in the book that she's become a translator because she didn't want to be seen, didn't want the spotlight. Do you think that's actually why people do become translators?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. That's a good question. It's definitely one thing I think when I used to translate video games. I this is going to sound very bad, but I sometimes used to get frustrated because I'd translate a story and I would think, oh, I could do this better. Like if only someone would let me write the story. Um, so I think that's probably why I'm more of a novelist than I am a translator, because I'm a bit of a control freak. But I think that sentiment I share with Flo in that I didn't write novels to be noticed. I don't particularly like having attention. I don't particularly like being in the spotlight. And I think that's why I wanted to be a writer, because it's very much something you can do by yourself. You have like complete creative control over it. And you're not someone who gets recognized, unless you're like Sally Rooney or Stephen King. Um, so I think that's what always attracted me to the idea of writing, because I love the idea of connecting with readers, because I'm a reader too, obviously, and I think one of the most pleasurable things about reading is kind of like, I know this is a bit of a cliche, but that part in Catcher in the Rye when he talks about reading a great book and you want to call up the author and chat to them like they're your friend. And that's what I've always found beautiful about literature is that, you know, when I was a student, I looked at Chaucer a lot, and I always used to marvel at the fact that reading Chaucer, it's almost like, you know, even though he was writing 600 years ago, you still, when you read his books, you still kind of feel like you're in the pub with him, listening to him tell a story. And that's what I've always loved about literature, that it's this thing that transcends space and time. You know, it's literally a time travel device that we've created, a technology that allows you to connect with people from the past. It's a wonderful thing. But it's also, I think, for me, I don't want to be the center of attention when I'm writing. And I think translators must feel the same. They want to not be noticed. When you're reading the book, I don't want people to think, wow, isn't Nick Bradley great? I want them to be so immersed in it. I want them to leave behind their lives and to really just care for the characters who I care so much for as well when I'm writing. So yeah, sorry, a long-winded answer, but I think Flo is kind of in agreement with me that she doesn't want to be the center of attention. She wants people to enjoy what she's done, and that's enough for her. And I feel the same way. I just want readers to enjoy what I've done. Yeah.
Did you have quite sort of conscious literary models or inspirations for Four Seasons in Japan?
Wow, a lot. I always find this one difficult to answer because I'll answer it differently. I think yeah. So and I also think people expect me to run off loads of Japanese writers, which is true. You know, I'd say if I Natsume Soseki is a huge inspiration. Um, Junichiro Tanizaki is a huge inspiration. Obviously Murakami I love. I also love the other Murakami, Ryu Murakami, but he wasn't so much an inspiration for this because but for this book in particular, I think one of the things that got me started was the Russian writer Turgenev. I really he wrote a book called Fathers and Sons, which got me thinking about the intergenerational aspect of this book. So I'd say that was definitely something that inspired me. I read a wonderful memoir by a manga artist. I've forgotten his name. I'm just going to check it. So it's this book. So A Drifting Life, and that's Yoshihiro Tatsumi. So he wrote a manga which is about his life as a manga artist. So it's quite meta in that respect. So you know, something like this was a huge help for me when I was writing about Kyo, who's a character who wants to be a manga artist. Um, but yeah, and then even just actually like children's novels from the UK, like I love Roald Dahl. There's a book by Michelle Magorian called Goodnight, Mr. Tom, which I was really thinking about a lot because it's an intergenerational friendship story. So yeah, that so many writers, and then just my absolute literary heroes like Ian Banks is I'm a huge Ian Banks fan. Terry Pratchett from a young age, he's inspired me. David Mitchell, obviously, like he's the boss, you know, my favorite living author. Um, yeah, I mean, I could really just go on and on. I mean, even Tolstoy. I think in lockdown I read War and Peace, and I think that helped me with setting the scene for Onamichi, the town. You know, describing the place, but then zooming in on the characters' thoughts. Like I took a lot of techniques from War and Peace. I think the ending, like one of the endings, the Ayako's ending is really inspired by the ending of Ulysses, which I think is probably one of the most uplifting endings of any novel. And not just because it's so long, you're just glad you finished it. But I genuinely love the ending of Ulysses. I think it's so joyous. So yeah, I'm really going on here, but you can see like you sometimes I think writers probably just get pressured to single out one or two books that have inspired a book, but I think everything you write is inspired by everything you've read, you know, and there's little bits that you're taking from here and there, and that's what creativity is really. It's a dialogue with the things that have inspired you, the things that have resonated with you.
Um, Maybe we should talk a little bit about the sort of fathers and sons connection. That would be a good way to talk about Ayako and Kyo, who maybe we haven't quite teased out fully. They're sort of 19-year-old sort of university dropout or hasn't made it into university, and his elderly grandmother. Uh, isn't and the whole sort of dynamic, as in fathers and sons, is the sort of the two generations who just completely don't get each other. Was that quite a sort of productive dynamic for you?
Yeah, I really loved it. Because it was Turgenev that got me thinking about it, about the because I put that book down. And I thought, wow, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed since he wrote that. The old always look at the young and think, oh, they don't know anything. They're naive, and they haven't got the experience that we have. But the old forget that they were once young and that they had the same feelings towards the old then. And equally, the young look at the old and think, oh, they're old fashioned. They're not keeping up with the times. They don't have the ambition and the drive that we do. But they forget that one day they will be old. And and so that got me thinking, and also got me thinking about how unsavory modern life can be, and that the internet tends to make you think that everyone's really extreme and that no one understands each other. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think the internet makes us feel that way, but I think that real life is full of very different people who interact each day, and they interact successfully, where they learn from each other and they grow. And so I started to build the characters of Ayako and Kyo from the concept of the yin and yang, the Chinese concept. And so Kyo was representative of the white, masculine, youthful, ambitious, all that stuff. And Ayako is representative of the black, feminine, wise, all these things. So, and that helped me flesh out their characters, but it also helped me understand that if I put them in a room together, they're going to clash, but that collision is going to cause something, and it's going to cause growth in both. They're going to learn from each other, and they're going to grow as people. So yeah, definitely. Oh, I just realized as well, when I was talking about Kyo, you can see Kyo's illustrations in the books too.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a
Don't worry.
reason for everyone. It's a reason for everyone to buy a copy if you haven't already. That actually leads us to another question, actually, from the audience. Ayako's obsessions and flaws drive the plot. You seem to portray her as heroic. Is that a fair assessment?
Ayako, I don't know. So initially her character. So I think when I had readers read her initially, some people didn't like her. Um, I think Ayako is. I mean, I really love all my characters. I have such fondness for all of them. Um, I think Ayako is hard. She is, um, a tough person, but I think that she has a heart. She is someone who loves, and she's trying to do the best she can do. And also, I think one of the things I was thinking about with her character is how unfair life has been on her. I mean, she's an extremely bright, intelligent, brilliant woman who, because of society, has been told what she can and can't do. And I think she is heroic in a sense, because her ability, her mountain climbing, it, you know, what she endures and what she achieves is really quite incredible. And I think the other thing with Ayako, that at the beginning of the novel, I think Ayako has achieved some kind of Zen um, enlightenment, even at the beginning of the book, because she's able to just appreciate her day. And I think that that's the thing that she teaches Kyo. Not to spoil the novel too much, but in some ways, there's like we could all learn a lot from Ayako. Just even at the beginning, at the outset, how much she's lost. Losing her husband, losing her father, losing her son. Um, she's someone who's dealt with loss and has overcome it, and she's found a beauty in the mundane, in the day to day. So, I to me, Ayako is a hero. To other people, she might not be, but to me, she means a lot. Yeah.
We have one final question about yeah, your process for translating Japanese poems. I guess I'm interested in this too. I don't know, I guess what makes a Japanese poem poetry as opposed to prose? What are the sort of considerations of, rhythm, meter, rhyme, if there are such things?
Hmm, good question. Um, well, so translating haiku, I think, is a tough one, because haiku are very set in terms of syllabic structure. There's a question, when you translate a haiku, should you retain the 5 7 5 syllables in English, even though that's very hard to do, or should you try and capture just the sort of essence of it? Um, I think, yeah. So translating uh, without losing to the rain. I mean, to me, it it's such. I think some like that poem to me is kind of, if I had to choose an English equivalent, I would say it's something like "If" by Rudyard Kipling. Um, and I'd say it's so that poem in particular was found in his notebook after he died. So he didn't like write it to be published. He wrote it and in katakana in a little notebook, and it was discovered. And you could say it's a poem, or you could just say it's a rule for being a good person. It's a rule for how to be good, and how to be humble, how to be kind. So whether it's a poem in the strictest sense of the words, I'm not sure. I mean, definitely, like, it doesn't have to rhyme in Japanese to be a poem. And the same is true now in English. I think, I'm not a poetry expert, so I'm kind of struggling a bit with this question. Um, but but I mean, for me, what I try to do when I translate anything is I try and retain the spirit, the feeling behind the words. And with the first poem that I translated for The Cat in the City, I took major liberties on one of the lines because it wouldn't translate well. So I thought, well, I'm almost going to rewrite this line. I haven't had any complaints about it yet, but I think I retain the spirit of it without having to sort of do a literal translation. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. That's probably all we have time for, I'm afraid. Thank you everyone for tuning in this afternoon. Thank you for your questions, and thank you especially to Nick Bradley. It's been a really fascinating hour for me and for everyone else, I'm sure. So please, a big virtual round of applause for him. Yes, before we log off, just a reminder that there's still 2.5 days left to run in this year's festival. Lots to enjoy. So do check out our website for information about what's on and where. I should also say that Four Seasons in Japan is available to buy in Greaves in Berwick or in any other good bookshop. I'd really recommend you get a copy. It's a terrific read. In the meantime, thank you so much, Nick, for doing this.
Thanks, George. Thank you.
It's been really great chatting.
Thanks, everyone.
And yeah, thank you. And I hope you all have a very nice evening. Goodbye.